I was scrolling through my phone on a Tuesday night, already in my pajamas with a glass of wine balanced on the arm of my couch, when I saw the notification that my sister Madison was live on Instagram. I almost didn't click it. Our relationship had been strained for years, reduced to obligatory holiday appearances and the occasional liked post, but something made me tap the screen anyway, and within 30 seconds, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. There she was, my younger sister, perfectly lit and camera-ready in her apartment that our parents had helped her furnish, talking to her 53,000 followers about her poor sister who works in customer service. The words came out of her mouth so casually, so thoughtlessly cruel, as she tilted her head with that practiced sympathy she'd perfected for her audience. I just feel so bad for her, you know? She's almost 32 and she's still answering phones at some call center. Like, I've tried to give her advice about building a personal brand, but she just doesn't get it. She's stuck in this sad little customer service job making probably what, 30,000 a year? Maybe 40 if she's lucky? She laughed. And it wasn't even a mean laugh exactly, which somehow made it worse. It was pitying, dismissive. The comments started flooding in, strangers who had never met me offering their own sympathetic emojis and remarks about how hard it must be for Madison to have such an unsuccessful sibling. Someone wrote, "At least she has a job, I guess." And another said, "Some people just aren't meant for success." Madison nodded along, reading the comments aloud, building an entire narrative about my pathetic existence for her audience's entertainment. She talked about how our parents worried about me, how I'd never been ambitious like her, how I'd always been content with mediocrity. My hands were shaking as I watched, and I could feel heat rising in my face, that particular mixture of humiliation and rage that comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by someone who should know you better than anyone. The worst part was that she believed every word she was saying. She genuinely thought I was struggling, barely making ends meet, working some dead-end job that I was too embarrassed to talk about at family dinners. She had no idea that the reason I never talked about my work was because I'd learned years ago that nothing I did would ever matter to them the way her social media metrics did. She didn't know that the customer service company she was mocking so casually was actually mine, that I'd founded it 5 years ago and built it from nothing into a $15 million business. She had absolutely no idea that her struggling, pathetic older sister was the CEO. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. Watching Madison on that live stream, I was suddenly transported back to every moment in our lives when this pattern had been established, when the roles had been assigned and the hierarchy made clear. I remembered my high school graduation, when I'd finished as salutatorian with a full scholarship to Boston University, and how the celebration dinner had been cut short because Madison, then only 14, had a dance recital the next morning that required early bedtime. I remembered coming home for Thanksgiving my junior year of college with a 3.9 GPA and news that I'd been accepted into a competitive research program, sitting at the dinner table ready to share, only to have the entire meal consumed by discussion of Madison's new YouTube channel where she was posting makeup tutorials. Our parents had watched her videos on their phones right there at the table, gushing over her creativity and natural charisma, while my research program acceptance letter stayed folded in my pocket, unmentioned. The pattern continued through my college graduation, when my parents arrived late because they'd been helping Madison film content for her Instagram, which she'd just started and which had maybe 300 followers at the time. They'd missed the ceremony entirely, showed up for the reception afterward with apologies that felt perfunctory, and spent most of the event on their phones checking how Madison's latest post was performing. When I'd gotten my first real job after graduation, a position at a tech startup in Austin that I'd been genuinely excited about, my mother's response had been to ask if I thought I could help Madison monetize her growing social media presence. Maybe give her some professional advice about business. It hadn't mattered that I was 22 years old and barely knew what I was doing myself. What mattered was how I could be useful to Madison's trajectory. My father had nodded along, saying it was good that I'd have something stable to fall back on, as if my degree and my job offer were just safety nets for an otherwise unremarkable existence. Madison had always been the star, the one with the visible talent, the one people noticed. She was beautiful in that effortless way that photographs well, charismatic and funny in front of a camera, able to make friends instantly wherever she went. I didn't resent her for those qualities exactly, but I resented the way our parents had decided early on that her path was the one worth celebrating, that her kind of success was the only kind that mattered. My achievements were always met with polite acknowledgement at best, or at worst, complete dismissal. When I'd graduated with my MBA at 26, having worked full-time while completing the program at night, my mother had asked if I'd gotten any good photos she could post on Facebook. Not congratulations, not pride, just whether I'd documented it in a way that could be shared, as if the accomplishment itself was meaningless without social media validation. The company that Madison had dismissed so casually on her live stream, the sad little customer service job she'd mocked in front of 50,000 people, had started 5 years ago in my one-bedroom apartment in Austin with nothing but my savings, my MBA, and an idea that kept me up at night. I'd been working at that tech startup for 3 years, and I'd noticed a gap in the market that nobody seemed to be addressing, a way to use AI and machine learning to make customer service software more intuitive and effective. Something that could actually help companies connect with their customers instead of frustrating them with endless phone trees and scripted responses. I'd spent 6 months building the first prototype while working 60-hour weeks at my day job, teaching myself coding languages I didn't know, reaching out to every contact I'd made in the industry for advice and feedback. When I finally left my job to pursue it full-time, I told my parents I was doing consulting work in customer service, which was technically true but deliberately vague, and they'd nodded with that familiar polite disinterest that told me they weren't really listening. Madison had just started her Instagram account at that point, posting lifestyle content and fashion photos that were getting a few hundred likes, and every family phone call centered on her growing follower count, her engagement rates, the brands that were starting to notice her. Nobody asked about my consulting work. Nobody asked what I was building. The first year was brutal in ways I'd never experienced. Working 100-hour weeks, maxing out my credit cards, eating ramen, and learning to live on 4 hours of sleep. But I'd also never felt more alive, more certain that I was building something that mattered. I brought on my first employee, a developer named Marcus, who believed in the vision enough to work for equity, and then a customer service expert named Jennifer, who'd left her corporate job to take a chance on a startup. We landed our first client 10 months in, a mid-sized e-commerce company that paid us $15,000 for a 6-month pilot program, and I remembered crying in my apartment that night because it meant I could finally pay myself an actual salary, even if it was just enough to cover rent and groceries. The company grew slowly at first, then faster, and I made the deliberate choice not to tell my family the details because I wanted, desperately, to be valued for something other than my bank account or my title. I wanted them to ask about my life because they cared about me, not because I'd finally achieved the kind of success they could brag about to their friends. By year 3, we had 20 employees and annual revenue of $2 million. By year 4, we'd expanded to both coasts and hit $8 million in revenue. Now, 5 years in, ConnectCore employed 207 people across 3 offices, generated $15 million in annual revenue, served clients like Delta Airlines and Nordstrom and Kaiser Permanente, and had won 2 industry awards for innovation in customer experience technology. And I was the CEO, the founder, making a base salary of $400,000 a year, plus equity that was worth considerably more. Living in a house I'd bought with cash in a neighborhood my parents had once told me was probably out of your price range. Madison's influencer career had taken off about 3 years ago, right around the time ConnectCore was hitting its stride and becoming genuinely profitable. Though, of course, nobody in my family knew that because they never asked about my work beyond the vaguest pleasantries. She'd started with Instagram, posting carefully curated lifestyle content, fashion photos shot in downtown Portland where she lived, coffee shop aesthetics, and golden hour selfies that showed off her admittedly photogenic face and her natural ability to look effortlessly cool. Her follower count had grown slowly at first, then faster, and I remembered the family dinner when she'd hit 10,000 followers, and our parents had literally toasted her success with champagne, my father making a speech about how proud he was of her entrepreneurship and creativity. I'd been visiting from Austin that weekend, and I'd sat there with a glass of that same champagne, saying nothing about the fact that my company had just signed a contract with a major retail chain worth $500,000. Madison had expanded to TikTok and YouTube over the next year, posting day-in-the-life vlogs, shopping hauls, apartment tours, relationship advice, and the kind of personal storytelling content that built parasocial relationships with her audience. She was good at it, genuinely good, creating content that felt authentic and relatable, while still being aspirational enough to keep people watching. By her second year, she'd crossed 25,000 followers on Instagram and started getting brand deals, partnerships with clothing companies, and skincare lines that sent her free products in exchange for posts and stories. The family group chat became a constant stream of updates about Madison's latest sponsorship, her growing audience, the comments from followers telling her how much they loved her. Our parents shared every single one of her posts on their own Facebook accounts, writing captions about how proud they were of their daughter, the influencer, the entrepreneur, the creative. 6 months ago, Madison had hit 50,000 followers on Instagram and launched a YouTube channel that quickly grew to 30,000 subscribers, and our parents had thrown her a party, an actual celebration with catering and decorations and 40 guests, all to commemorate this milestone in her influencer career. I'd flown home for it because declining would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give, and I'd stood in the corner of the rented event space watching a slideshow of Madison's best posts, projected on the wall while people congratulated her on building such an impressive platform. My mother had given a tearful speech about always knowing Madison was destined for greatness, about her special spark that drew people to her. Nobody had mentioned me except to introduce me to guests as Madison's older sister, who works in customer service in Texas. Madison had been monetizing her content for over a year now, making what I estimated was probably $50,000 to $60,000 annually from a combination of brand partnerships, affiliate links, YouTube ad revenue, and the occasional paid sponsorship. And while that was genuinely impressive for someone who'd built it from nothing, it had become the sole measure of success in our family's eyes. Every holiday dinner, every phone call, every family gathering centered entirely on Madison's content calendar, her engagement rates, her latest viral video, her strategies for growth. When I'd come home for Christmas last year, the entire dinner conversation had revolved around whether Madison should accept a partnership with a fitness tea company, with our parents weighing in seriously as if this were a major business decision, while nobody had asked me a single question about my own work beyond still doing the customer service thing, which I'd answered with a simple yes, before the conversation returned immediately to Madison's brand alignment and authenticity concerns. The last 6 months had been particularly difficult in ways that made me question why I was still protecting my family from the truth about my success, why I was still allowing them to treat me like the disappointing daughter who'd never quite figured out how to make something of herself. The comments from Madison had become more frequent and more cutting. Little remarks at family dinners about those of us who actually built our own platforms, and suggestions that I should think about developing some kind of personal brand, since customer service was kind of a dead-end field. At Easter dinner, she'd spent 20 minutes explaining her content strategy to our parents while they listened with rapt attention. And when I'd tried to contribute something about customer experience trends in tech, Madison had literally patted my hand and said, "That's sweet that you're interested in the business side of things, but there's a difference between working for a company and building your own empire." and our parents had nodded along as if she'd said something profound instead of something deeply condescending. 2 months ago, my father had pulled me aside after a family barbecue and suggested, in the gentle tone you'd use with someone who was struggling, that maybe I should talk to Madison about her success strategies, because she really understands how to create value in today's economy, and perhaps I could learn something about entrepreneurship from her. I'd stood there in their backyard, the CEO of a $15 million Isan company, being told to take business advice from my younger sister who made a fraction of what I made. And I'd smiled and said I'd think about it because what else could I say without revealing everything? My mother had started making comments about being worried about my financial situation, asking if I was doing okay money-wise, and offering to help with bills if I needed it. And when I'd assured her I was fine, she'd given me that look of maternal concern mixed with pity that made my stomach hurt. The weight of maintaining the secret had become almost unbearable, this constant performance of being less successful than I was, this acceptance of their assumptions that I was barely scraping by while Madison thrived. But I'd held on to it because some part of me still hoped they would eventually see me, really see me, without needing the validation of a title or a salary or tangible proof of achievement. I'd wanted them to value me for who I was, not what I'd built, to ask about my life because they cared about their daughter, not because I'd finally done something impressive enough to warrant their attention. But that hope had been slowly dying with every dismissive comment, every conversation that centered entirely on Madison's latest sponsorship deal, every family event where I was introduced as an afterthought while Madison was celebrated as the success story, and I'd begun to realize that my silence wasn't protecting anything worth protecting, that it was only enabling a dynamic that diminished me and allowed them to continue seeing me as someone I wasn't. The live stream that I'd stumbled onto that Tuesday evening was worse than I could have imagined, and I sat there in my home office in Austin watching it on my phone with a feeling of cold spreading through my chest as Madison performed her casual cruelty for an audience of 50,000 people who were eating it up. She was sitting in her Portland apartment, the one with the exposed brick wall and the trendy plants that featured in so many of her posts. And she was doing a life update and real talk stream that had clearly been running for a while before I'd gotten the notification. Someone in the chat had asked about her family, whether she had siblings, and Madison had gotten this particular expression on her face, the one that signaled she was about to share something juicy, something her audience would find entertaining. "Oh God, yeah. I have an older sister," she'd said, and I'd watched her lean toward the camera with that practiced intimacy that influencers cultivated, that sense of sharing secrets with close friends. She's honestly kind of a sad situation. Like, I love her obviously, she's family, but she's just really struggled to find her path, you know? The chat had immediately filled with heart emojis and comments asking for details, and Madison had been happy to provide them. She works this really basic customer service job in Texas, like answering phones and dealing with complaints all day, and she's been doing it for years now, just kind of stuck in the same place, Madison had said, and every word had felt like a physical blow, because she wasn't just exaggerating or spinning things, she was completely making things up, inventing details about my life that weren't true to create a better story for her viewers. I think she makes like 30,000 a year maybe? Our parents are constantly worried about her, but she's really proud, so she won't accept help. And it's just hard to watch someone you care about barely scraping by when they could be doing so much more with their life. I'd sat there frozen, watching the comments scroll past with their sympathetic messages, their second-hand concern for Madison's struggling sister, their praise for Madison being so caring and worried about her family. "The worst part is she doesn't even seem to want to change anything," Madison had continued, really warming to her topic now, her voice taking on that particular tone of performative compassion that made my skin crawl. Like, I've tried to give her advice about building her personal brand, maybe starting a side hustle or learning some new skills, but she's just so stuck in this victim mentality where she thinks the world is against her instead of taking responsibility for her own life. And I'm like, babe, you're 32. At some point, you have to stop blaming circumstances and actually do something. The chat had exploded with comments agreeing with Madison's tough love approach, calling her a good sister for being honest, sharing their own stories about family members who refused to help themselves. And through it all, Madison had sat there nodding and sighing and accepting their validation for publicly humiliating me to an audience of 50,000 strangers who now believed they knew the truth about my pathetic, struggling existence. I watched the live stream continue for another 10 minutes, unable to look away even though every word felt like another cut. And by the time Madison finally moved on to talking about her upcoming brand partnerships, I had gone through hurt and landed somewhere in the territory of cold, crystalline anger that made my hands shake as I reached for my laptop. I opened the screen recording software that I kept for work presentations and went back to the beginning of Madison's stream, capturing every single second of her talking about me, every invented detail about my supposed poverty, every performative sigh about her struggling older sister, every comment from her audience joining in the mockery or offering sympathy for the burden of having a family member who couldn't get their life together. The evidence sat there in my downloads folder, a 15-minute video file that documented exactly what my sister thought of me and exactly how willing she was to exploit our relationship for content. And I sat there staring at it for a long moment before I pulled out my phone and opened the text. Thread with Madison. Really enjoying your live stream, I typed, my fingers moving fast across the screen. Interesting perspective on my life. We should talk. I watched the message go from delivered to read almost immediately, but no response came through. And when I switched back to the live stream on my other monitor, I could see Madison glance at her phone and then deliberately set it face down, continuing her conversation with her chat about whether she preferred working with fashion brands or lifestyle brands. She wasn't going to respond. She'd seen that I knew what she'd said, that I'd watched her humiliate me in front of 50,000 people, and she was choosing to just keep streaming, to pretend nothing had happened, to let me sit with the knowledge that this was how she really saw me. That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. The moment when whatever fragile hope I'd been holding on to about my family just evaporated like water on hot concrete. I'd spent 5 years protecting them from the truth about my success because I'd wanted to believe they could love me without it, that I was valuable to them as just their daughter and sister, that achievement and money and titles didn't matter as much as the actual person I was. But Madison had just shown me exactly how much I mattered when I wasn't useful to her narrative, when I was just the boring older sister with the unglamorous job. And the fact that she'd rather invent a more interesting story about my failure than actually ask me about my real life told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family. I closed the live stream and opened my contacts, scrolling down to Jennifer Chen, my executive assistant who'd been with me since the company had 15 employees and who knew exactly how much my family's dismissal had hurt over the years. Jennifer, I said when she picked up on the second ring, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, calm and clear and absolutely certain. I need your help planning something. It's time my family learned the truth about what I actually do, and I want to make sure they understand it completely. Jennifer answered my request with the calm efficiency that had made her indispensable to me over the past 3 years. And by the time we ended our call 40 minutes later, we had the framework of a plan that would leave absolutely no room for my family to dismiss or minimize what I'd built. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and went straight to my corner suite on the 4th floor of our building in downtown Austin, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake, and I began pulling together the documentation that would make my position undeniably clear. I started with the incorporation papers from 5 years ago, the official state documents that listed me as founder and CEO of ConnectStream Solutions, the customer service software platform that had grown from my one-bedroom apartment operation into a company that now occupied 3 floors of a Class A office building and employed 207 people across 5 states. Then I pulled up our most recent quarterly revenue report, the one that showed we'd hit $15.3 million in annual recurring revenue, a number that represented thousands of businesses across North America who paid us to handle their customer service operations through our proprietary AI-enhanced platform that I'd spent 2 years developing before we'd even signed our first client. I printed out the client list that Jennifer had compiled, the one that included 2 Fortune 500 companies, 18 major e-commerce platforms, and 43 rapidly growing startups who trusted us with their customer relationships. And I added to that the industry recognition we'd received over the past 18 months, including the Austin Business Journal's Fastest Growing Tech Company Award, the Software Association's Innovation Prize, and my own inclusion on the 40 Under 40 list that had come out just 3 months ago, with my photo and a detailed profile about building a successful company as a woman in tech. I pulled my employment contract from the secure files, the one that specified my base salary of $420,000, plus equity and performance bonuses that had pushed my total compensation last year to just over $600,000, and I set it aside with my personal tax returns that showed exactly how far I was from the $30,000 struggling existence that Madison had invented for her live stream audience. The office lease for our headquarters sat in another folder, a 5-year agreement for 22,000 square feet at one of Austin's premier business addresses, and I added to the growing pile the bank statements showing our operating capital, the term sheets from our Series A funding round 2 years ago when we'd raised $8 million, and the preliminary projections for our Series B that we were planning for next spring. Jennifer knocked on my door around 10 and came in with printed testimonials she'd gathered from department heads, brief statements about my leadership and vision that I hadn't asked for but that she'd known would matter, and she set them on my desk with the knowing look of someone who understood exactly what this evidence was really about. "I've also scheduled our quarterly all-hands meeting for next Thursday at 2, she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I took the liberty of mentioning that you'd like to invite some guests. Should I send you the invitation template for your family?" I looked at the stack of documentation spread across my desk, 5 years of work and achievement and success that my family had never asked about because they'd been too busy celebrating Madison's Instagram aesthetics and sponsored posts. And I felt something settle in my chest that was equal parts vindication and grief for what I'd hoped our relationships could be. I spent Tuesday afternoon crafting the invitation email, working through 6 different drafts, before I landed on the tone that felt right, professional enough to be taken seriously, but vague enough that my family wouldn't understand what they were walking into until it was too late to maintain their comfortable assumptions about my place in the world. "You're invited to attend Connect Stream Solutions' quarterly all-hands meeting and company celebration," I wrote, including the address of our downtown headquarters, the date and time, and a brief note that I'd be participating in the presentation and would love to have them there to see what I did at work. I didn't say I was the CEO. I didn't mention that I owned the company. I just let the words sit there on the screen, innocuous and forgettable, the kind of invitation that could easily be interpreted as a mid-level employee proud to show her family around her workplace, and I hit send to all 3 of them before I could second-guess the decision. My mother's response came within an hour, a brief text that said, "That's nice, honey. Your father and I will try to make it if we don't have anything else that day." The kind of lukewarm acknowledgement that had characterized her response to everything in my life that wasn't Madison-related. And I felt the familiar sting of being an afterthought, even as I reminded myself that this was exactly why the revelation needed to happen. Madison didn't respond at all for 2 days, and when she finally did, it was a message that said, "I guess I can come by for a bit, but I have a sponsored post due that evening, so I can't stay long." With no acknowledgement of the live stream, no apology for what she'd said, no recognition that anything between us had changed, even though she knew I'd watched her mock me to her entire audience. My father's response came last, a forwarded calendar invite with "accepted" as the only text. And I sat there looking at the three responses that perfectly encapsulated my family's regard for me, and wondered if I was doing the right thing, or if I was just setting myself up for a different kind of hurt. The week that followed was strange, a period of going through the motions at work, while my mind kept circling back to Thursday's all hands meeting, and what would happen when my family finally understood who I actually was. And I found myself alternating between fierce anticipation and a grief that felt disproportionate to the situation until I realized I was mourning the family I'd wanted to have, the one that would have celebrated my success instead of forcing me to use it as a weapon. Jennifer checked in with me 3 times during the week, asking if I wanted to change anything about the plan, giving me opportunities to back out or soften the revelation. But each time I thought about Madison's voice saying, "She makes like 30,000 a year at most," to 50,000 strangers, I felt my resolve harden into something that couldn't be bent or broken. I briefed my leadership team on Wednesday, explaining without going into too much detail that my family would be attending and that they didn't know about my role in the company. And to their credit, nobody asked why or made me feel like I needed to justify the strange situation. They just nodded and promised to treat Thursday's meeting like any other quarterly gathering, where the CEO addressed the entire staff about our progress and vision. Thursday arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn weather that makes Austin beautiful, the sky impossibly blue above the glass and steel of downtown, and I stood in the lobby of our building at 1:45, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as my family's car pulled up to the entrance, my mother driving her silver Lexus into the circular drop-off area with my father in the passenger seat, and Madison visible in the back with her phone already raised in what I recognized as her live streaming position. They climbed out of the car with visible confusion on their faces as they took in the building's modern architecture, the prominent Connect Stream Solutions logo etched into the granite facade, the carefully landscaped entrance with its water feature and native Texas plants. And I watched Madison pan her phone camera across the building's exterior while saying something I couldn't hear but could imagine, probably some dismissive comment about corporate culture or soulless office buildings, delivered in that breathy voice she used when she was performing relatability for her audience. I waited until they'd made it through the revolving doors before I stepped forward from where I'd been standing near the elevator bank, and the receptionist at the front desk, Marcus, who I'd briefed personally about today, immediately stood and said in a voice loud enough to carry across the marble lobby, "Ms. Chen, your guests have arrived. Should I take them up to the 4th floor, or would you like to greet them here first?" I saw my mother's head turn sharply at the deferential tone, saw my father's eyebrows raise slightly, and watched Madison's live stream falter for just a second before she recovered and kept filming, and I walked toward them with what I hoped was a calm smile that didn't betray the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Thanks, Marcus. I'll take them up myself," I said, and I turned to my family and gestured toward the elevators. "Thanks for coming. I know it's a Thursday afternoon and you probably have other things to do." My mother was looking around the lobby with an expression I couldn't quite read, taking in the expensive furnishings and the abstract art on the walls and the general atmosphere of success that money could buy, and she said, "This is a very nice building. I didn't realize your company was so, well, established." Madison was still filming, had turned the camera to include me in the frame now, and she said for her audience's benefit, "So my sister works here and apparently she's giving us the grand tour, very corporate, very 9 to 5 energy," with that subtle mockery in her voice that had characterized every comment she'd made about my career for the past 3 years. My father simply nodded at me and said, "Should we head up then?" And I led them to the elevator bank, pressed the button for the 4th floor, and felt the weight of what was about to happen settle over me like a physical thing as the doors slid closed and we began to rise. The elevator doors opened onto the 4th floor, and I stepped out into the main workspace of Connect Stream Solutions, the open floor plan stretching across nearly 15,000 square feet, with its carefully designed mix of collaborative spaces and private focus rooms, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of downtown Austin that I'd never stopped being grateful for. And I heard my mother make a small sound of surprise as she took in the scale of the operation. The dozens of employees visible at their standing desks or gathered in the glass-walled conference rooms. The modern aesthetic that had cost us a considerable amount in our office build-out 2 years ago, but had been worth every dollar for the culture it helped create. This way, I said, leading them down the main corridor that ran along the windows, and immediately I saw heads turn as employees recognized me, several people calling out, "Hi, Sarah," or "Good to see you," with the casual familiarity that came from working in a company where I made it a point to know everyone's name and check in regularly about their projects and lives. My mother was walking slightly behind me, her eyes moving from face to face as if trying to understand why so many people seemed to know her daughter, and my father had his hands in his pockets with that neutral expression he wore when he was processing information he didn't quite understand, and Madison was still filming, had turned her phone to capture the office space while saying in a low voice clearly meant for her microphone, "So this is where my sister works. Very tech startup vibes. Everyone's very friendly. She's apparently popular here, which is cute. I guess when you're in an office this small, everyone knows everyone." I felt a flicker of irritation at small when we employed 200 people across 3 floors, but I didn't correct her, just kept walking past the engineering pod where David and his team were deep in a code review, past the customer success department where Angela waved at me with a grin that suggested Jennifer had briefed her about what was happening today, past the kitchen area with its expensive espresso machine, and the wall of snacks that had been my idea because I remembered too well the startups where I'd worked while building this company and how much it mattered to have your basic needs met while you were giving your employer your best hours. "Sarah, are all these people your coworkers?" my mother asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion that suggested she was beginning to realize that something about her understanding of my life didn't align with what she was witnessing, and I turned back to look at her and said simply, "Something like that. We're heading to the all-hands meeting now. It's just through here." I pushed open the double doors that led to our largest conference room, the one we used for quarterly meetings and company celebrations, and I heard my father's sharp intake of breath as he saw the space, the 150 employees already seated in the rows of chairs we'd set up facing the small stage at the front, the professional presentation setup with screens and microphones, the banner hanging across the back wall that read, "Connect Stream Solutions Q4 All Hands Meeting," with our company logo prominently displayed, and I gestured to 3 seats I'd had reserved in the front row, watching Madison's live stream capture her stunned expression as she panned across the crowd and finally seemed to understand that this was not a small office tour, but something much bigger than she'd anticipated. I watched my family take their seats in the front row, saw Madison still holding her phone, but lower now, the live stream continuing, but her commentary noticeably absent as she seemed to be processing the scale of what she was witnessing, and I walked down the side aisle toward the stage with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, climbed the 3 steps to the platform, and stood behind the podium as Jennifer moved to the microphone from where she'd been waiting in the wings. Her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes meeting mine for just a second with an encouraging warmth that steadied me. "Good afternoon, everyone," Jennifer said to the assembled employees, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Thank you all for making time for today's quarterly all-hands meeting. I know we've had a busy week with the product launch, but I wanted to take a moment before we begin to welcome some special guests who are joining us today, and to remind everyone why we do this work and who leads us in that mission." She paused, turned slightly toward me, and continued in a voice that I knew carried to every corner of the room and definitely to my family in the front row. "I'd like to invite to the stage our CEO and founder, Sarah Chen, who started this company 5 years ago with a vision of revolutionizing how businesses connect with their customers and who has built Connect Stream Solutions into the industry leader we are today." I stepped forward to the microphone as the room erupted in applause, genuine and warm and loud enough that I saw my mother's head whip around to look at the employees behind her, as if she couldn't believe this reception was for her daughter, And I looked down at Madison and saw that her phone had captured the moment, had recorded Jennifer's introduction and my approach to the microphone, and more importantly, had recorded her own face in the front-facing camera, her expression frozen in shock so complete that she looked almost unrecognizable. I took a breath, gripped the sides of the podium to steady my shaking hands, and began the speech I'd prepared, my voice stronger than I'd expected when I said, "Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all for being here today. I know quarterly meetings aren't anyone's favorite part of the job, but I want to take this opportunity to reflect on how far we've come and where we're heading." I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a graph showing our revenue growth from year one to present, the upward trajectory dramatic and undeniable, and I continued. When I started ConnectStream 5 years ago, it was just me and a laptop in a coffee shop, writing code and cold calling potential clients, and learning every aspect of this business from the ground up. I worked 16-hour days for the first 2 years. I maxed out 3 credit cards, I survived on ramen and hope, and I did it because I believed that customer service technology could be better, more intuitive, more human. I saw my father lean forward in his seat, his expression intent now, focused on me in a way I couldn't remember seeing in years, and I clicked to the next slide, photos from our early days, images I'd dug out of my archives showing the tiny first office we'd rented, the team of 5 employees who'd taken a chance on an unknown startup, the whiteboard covered in feature plans and revenue projections that had seemed impossibly ambitious at the time. Today, we employ 200 people across 3 states. We serve over 500 enterprise clients. We processed 15 million customer interactions last quarter alone, and we've been recognized by Tech Innovator magazine as one of the fastest growing private companies in the Southwest, I said. And I let myself look directly at my family now, let them see the confidence in my face that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I'd built, and I finished. None of this would be possible without the incredible team in this room. Your dedication and creativity and willingness to push boundaries is what makes ConnectStream special, and I'm honored to work alongside you every day. The applause that followed was thunderous, employees standing, and I watched my mother's face as she slowly rose to her feet with everyone else. Her expression shell-shocked, watched Madison's live stream shake slightly as her hands trembled, and I knew that everything had changed. The all-hands meeting concluded after another 30 minutes of quarterly updates from our department heads, presentations I barely registered as I watched my family from the stage, saw the way my mother kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, the way my father sat rigidly upright,